At the end of the Baroque era, as the world began to innovate and stabilize, both scientifically and politically, the music world started to change with it. The introduction of tonal harmony by Bach, the introduction of formal musical structures, the superiority of the string quartet, and the precedence of the sonata as the major form of chamber music ushered in the era of classicism. One of the greatest innovations, however, was the introduction of the symphony, whose development would drastically change the world of music over the next 200 years. The symphony was heavily influenced by both the sinfonia, its direct antecedent used as an introductory movement to common things such as operas, cantatas, oratorios, arias, and concertos, and the sonata, which was prized as both a solo repertoire and a unique independent musical structure. The Sinfonia's three-movement structure carried over into the early symphony. Sammartini was the biggest pioneer of this early style, fully reflecting the sonata process with a fully recapitulating opening tonic and closing dominant sections, as displayed in his Symphony in F major, number 32. Johann Stamitz, director of the Mannheim Orchestra around 1750, took the three-movement symphony and transformed its most common form into a four-movement one, with the addition of a minuet and trio as the penultimate movement and a presto finale. The third movement, the minuet and trio, reflected the French dance style of the mid-17th century and an A-B-A prime structure with smaller ternary structures reminiscent of the sonata/rounded binary form. The four-movement symphonic structure continued its development into the 18th century, with the charge being led by composers like Haydn and Mozart, who used it to expand instrumentation, deepen textures, further develop thematic inclusion, and intensify the ability to create complex moods. The particular focus on the minuet and trio, the style which is pictured here, allowed these composers to play with meter, rhythm, and structure to create an engaging, forward-progressing transition to the final movement. A clear showing of 18th century innovation of the symphony within the third movement comes in Mozart's Symphony in G minor, K 550. The piece relies on grandiose chromaticism paired with alternating descending half steps, never fully reaching the comfort of an octave, and a feeling of hemiola to create a sense of melancholy and grief. Overlapping ascending and descending eighth note runs are underscored by a half note followed by a quarter note patterns. The texture is expanded through parallelism and imitation in the upper strings and woodwinds, while the lower woodwinds and strings stick to simple accompaniment in chromaticism. You will hear this in this musical example. The trio moves into a major key, giving respite to the listener's ear, very typical of the trio part of the third symphonic movement, as a way to create movement and draw the listener in before turning them loose to the finale. The use of legato, short quarter note phrases with a less dense texture creates rhythmic intensity by being put up against eighth note runs with staccato quarter notes at the end of phrases. The alternating rising and falling eighth note patterns between upper and lower instrumentation with accented offbeats leads to a tasteful key change. Key changes in this fashion were typical in the works of 18th century composers, like Mozart and Haydn. Overall, this movement maintained the classicism of the 18th century while including pre-romantic ideas, indicative of what the 19th century held in store. With the beginning of the 19th century came the growing impact of the Industrial Revolution and improvements in technology and communication, paralleled by an unfortunate increase in the gap between the upper and lower classes and fast-changing social and political landscapes. Composers sought to grasp this innovation and fight against corruption and negative change by creating truly romantic and expressive pieces. The symphony had exerted itself as a coherent genre on its own, separate from the sonata and concerto. The broadening of symphonic style to 4 or 5 movements, each with a unique character, called for medium to large orchestras. Such intense polyphony, taking in the widest variety of instrumentation while establishing musical unity, created a public tone, emulative of the communal sentiment shared by 19th century audiences. This continued to make the symphony a symbol of the relationship between the individual and the ideal society or state. This is specifically shown through the improvement and expansion of the dance suite third movement. Such changes are reflected in the music of Brahms and Beethoven, who challenged the musical establishment to think in more expressive and intuitive, yet worldly and connected ways. A perfect example is the third movement of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. Gutmann claims that it is the very first time the traditional diversion was invested with a proportion and breadth to compare with the other movements of a symphony. The change from a minuet and trio to a scherzo and trio is indicative of the 19th century composer's playful nature. The slowly layered introduction of instrumentation fortifies the movement and makes it unique while reflecting general musical ideals among the community of composition at the time. The primary melodic theme is composed of 3 staccato quarter notes, followed by neighbor tone to descending scale eighth note patterns. The genius comes, however, in the feeling of hemiola amidst already incongruous phrasing. The use of half-note/quarter note phrases and offbeat quarter notes on beats 1 and 3 in the upper woodwinds in the trio section creates a very light and airy 2 feel that contrasts greatly with the waltz-like pattern in the basses and cellos. These can be heard in the following examples. Just as the 19th century had brought its advancements in science, technology, and healthcare, the 20th century brought its own changes, as free thought and individuality were bolstered with the expansion of basic rights, like voting, to more people than ever before in history. At the same time, the century was marked by violence and human suffering beyond comprehension, as displayed in 2 massive world wars and the atrocity that was the Holocaust. It is no wonder that 20th century composers sought to find a balance in their music that reflected the sweet romantic tones of the Romantic era while leaving their own marks of ingenuity and unorthodoxy. Composers were presented with a unique challenge. It was critical to meet the criteria established by the classics of creating music with high quality, lasting value, a rewarding sensation, and the ability to mix tradition with novel ideas, while attempting to create new and exciting works of art with individual innovation. Rachmaninoff, along with Mahler and a few other 20th century composers, attempted to reclaim a romantic tone with added innovation, is clear in their compositions, with broad arching melodies, intentional phrasing and usage of dynamics, and grandiose expression exemplified in an aggrandized texture, all paralleled with changes in standard symphonic form and structure, instrumentation, and contrapuntal ideals. Composers like Schoenberg and Webern, however, imagined a completely new symphonic mold, challenging the accepted structure and even tonal harmony itself. Schoenberg's 12-tone method established tonality based on relationships between the individual 12 chromatic pitches, rather than around a tonic. These pitches appeared in rows or series that could be used in a straightforward fashion, in inversion, in retrograde, or in retrograde inversion. This method created the widest gap between audiences and composers in their evaluations of musical content, and yet composers, like Webern, flocked to Schoenberg's side to learn the secrets of this method. The clearest departure from typical symphonic structure and tonality is shown in Webern's Symphony, Opus 21. It is characterized by intense concentration, limited dynamics, and an avoidance of using rows that create tonal implications. The most apparent change is the absence of a third or fourth movement, which is highly emblematic of Webern's call to condensation and concentration, and the shift towards minimalism and unorthodoxy. The first movement of this piece is most like the third in structure and tenor, but it nonetheless transforms the expected into something beyond imagination. The overarching structure is binary, with the A section taking on a pointillistic tenor and the B section reflecting a canonic timbre. The original tone row that serves as the base for this movement is pictured below. It is important to note that the second half of the row is retrograde of the first half, as indicated by the arrows. The symmetry created in this process is reflective of the larger symmetry that is the root of this piece. This is further supported by the piece's vertical relations, in which the intervallic content of the upper half of the chord is mirrored in the lower half of the chord. The texture of this movement is broadened using Klangfarben melody, or tone color melody, a technique pioneered by Webern. Klangfarben melody involves passing off the melody between instruments after only one or two notes. Such a passage creates an oddly smooth unity out of something that would appear to be disjunct. This technique, paired with the sequential notes in opposing high and low registers, creates an expansive musical space quite unlike anything seen before its creation. Controlled dynamics, reaching no more than forte, and long half-note phrases, underscored by intentional crescendos and decrescendos, give Webern's first movement a feeling of calculated and yet fully organic ebb and flow. You'll hear the example of Klangfarben melody and see the symmetry in the following musical example. Webern's focus on progressive, forward-thinking compositional practice was key to the musical transformation seen in the 20th century. His music, specifically the deeply symmetrical and controlled Symphony Opus 21, generated a foundation in which true modern atonality could find its foothold, establishing itself over Romanticism and Classicism as the new way forward into which musical thought would develop. The advances of 20th century composers would not have been possible without the pioneers who came before them in the 18th and 19th centuries, who worked so desperately to establish the symphony as a credible, standalone, and influential form of music. From Stamitz and Haydn, to Brahms and Beethoven, and finally to Rachmaninoff and Webern, the symphony was stretched, condensed, and adapted to meet the needs of the particular times and context in which it inhabited. It is for certain that one thing did not change. That is, that at the core of symphonic ideology and thought is the essence of humanity, displayed in love, hope, faith, goodness, kindness, freedom, liberty, sadness, grief, pain, and so many other emotions and feelings. The symphony has been and will continue to be a timeless form of art, as long as humankind continues to see its reflection in the music before its eyes. This has been my presentation on the symphony, and I very much appreciate you listening. Thank you so much.